Good afternoon, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? My name is Sarah Reza. I am the co-curator of the Panoptic Garden, the public program for the Garden of Knowledge, the Uzbek National Pavilion for the 59th Venice Biennial, which is part of a long lineage that looks at several hundred centuries of science and its development within the 21st century context, particularly within the work of artists and practitioners that we have invited as part of Panoptic Garden to reassess and rethink what knowledge constitutes as in the contemporary context. And through the Panoptic Garden public program, my colleague Andreas Brinkmanis and I, who is just on his way, have had the great pleasure of involving a number of practitioners, from artists to thinkers to creative technologists, who have been grappling with what it means to think of a garden in terms of surveillance or panoptic vision, if you like, and to sort of unite these diverse concepts. So I'm very delighted to introduce today's speaker, Ergin Çavuşoğlu, who has traveled from London. He's an artist and a professor at the Middlesex University in London, an artist who works in diverse mediums, born in the former Yugoslavia, but now living and working in London, having studied at Goldsmiths College, and also represented Turkey in the Venice Biennial in 2003, as well as a number of major commissions and exhibitions globally throughout the world. Most recently, we had the pleasure to work together for the Solomon R. Guggenheim, as well as a forthcoming exhibition at Tufts, and also presentations in London coming up as well, and in Turkey. So thank you and welcome again. I also have two of my students from New York University, Ami Mehta to my right, and Sophia Baker to my left, who are part of the New York University Master's Program, Interactive Telecommunications Program. Ami recently graduated. Sophia is still with us for one more year. And both of them were united for this project to work alongside Ergin to develop fascinating interactive immersive game that brings together the language of Anatolian carpets, which were informed by the garden, and to create a maze-like sculpture, 3D sculpture that lives in a web environment, virtual environment, which will launch very shortly in the coming days. So we're excited to have a behind-the-scenes look at that. And we'll first have a little bit of a discussion and context about Ergin's practice, and particularly his work within the frames as an artist, as a human who has lived between many various different spaces. His work functions as an interlocutor, if you like, between themes of migration, liminality. But by migration, we really mean within this program the migration of people and ideas. And also thinking through the notion of space, human geographies, and movement within the plural form. So thank you, Ergin, and welcome.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very, very pleased to be taking part in this project, which is absolutely fascinating, and specifically working with Ami and Sophia, and of course your team and Andre. It's been a pleasure, and also thank you for the introduction. I mean, I've, as you suggested, I've kind of been between places for most of my life. I mean, I've been settled in London for a long time, but I kind of growing up in socialist communist Bulgaria until late 80s, and then spent some time in Turkey and studied in the UK. Yes, my practice has been informed by all this mobility, if you like, or being in between places, or kind of looking at notions of place and placelessness. At the same time, this kind of, as much as it applies contextually to what I do in terms of thinking and kind of developing ideas, it also applies to my understanding of what art is and the way I kind of approach the making of art I mean, sort of, I like questioning the positioning art within different, not just media, but also different ways of engagement, if you like, as you pointed out, you know, with Sophia and Amy, we're working on a kind of interactive game project. My practice ranges from a very kind of classically executed paintings, drawings, to anamorphic drawings that are quite complex to produce and architecturally, you know,
painting is at the core.
Painting has always been at the core because, as I said, I went to an art school at a very early age under the kind of the socialist regime, and it informed my practice for years to come because you're kind of introduced to a particular understanding of what art is, and then of course you spend the rest of your life trying to break these notions and to kind of undo the things. And in my kind of academic career, a lot of my teaching is around ideas of the skilling. However, you know, they come after the skilling has taken place.
Absolutely, and I think that is all this sort of myriad experience has really informed your practice. What has always struck me is your keen eye, the sort of notion of optics that resides within your practice as well. And within the frames of the panoptic garden, it's very interesting to involve you within that because the acute notion of looking is really very precise within your work. It's always like the surveillance exists as a third notion, a third eye, if you like, always, which is the camera, which is within your filmic works, and particularly those that employ the use of the camera. And perhaps you would be kind to show us a few before we dive into the project.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, the camera, or the so-called 1920s camera eye of Vertov, you know, I mean, it's very important because, actually talking about that, it's an interesting period because the idea of observing the reality at that time or capturing sort of in a documentary style, you know, engaging with real footage was very important that it's impartial. So there are moments where Vertov had to conceal the camera, you know, I mean, there were big cameras at the time. Anyhow, I mean, my practice obviously has been informed by these notions of surveillance, you know, being or navigating kind of constrained environments, borders, and so on and so forth. So, as I said, I've kind of transitioned from painting and then photography, spent many years working with photography, to film and video. And what's interesting, the film practice or the video practice for me was, I kind of found a bit of a liberation. It was more democratic, where I can employ not just skills, but ideas and ways of seeing, as you mentioned, sort of the lens, the optics.
But marry that with the many diverse interests, particularly your interest in literature. And this is something we have discussed many times. Ergin has an avid interest within the work of Italo Calvino. And one of the most important sort of connections between Venice and Central Asia was Invisible Cities.
Absolutely, absolutely. Invisible Cities is a remarkable book, of course, you know, talking about sort of linking the East and West, the Orient and the Occident. And there is... maybe I can actually, I'd love to read you a passage from the book.
Yes, please.
If that's okay. Now, Calvino, this is in Invisible Cities, and it's in a chapter called Cities and the Sky, and it's chapter 1. It goes like this. So in Eudoxia, which spreads both upward and down, with winding alleys, steps, dead ends, hovels, a carpet is preserved in which you can observe the city's true form. At first sight, nothing seems to resemble Eudoxia, less than the design of the carpet, laid out in symmetrical motifs whose patterns are repeated along straight and circular lines, interwoven with brilliantly colored spires, in a repetition that can be followed throughout the whole woof. But if you pause and examine it carefully, you become convinced that each place in the carpet corresponds to a place in the city, and all the things contained in the city are included in the design, arranged according to their true relationship, which escapes your eye, distracted by bustle, the throngs, and the shoving. Now, what's interesting is, of course, this very much references the idea of the carpet as the origins of the carpet as a reproduction of a garden, and Foucault obviously kind of he elaborates that in Of Other Spaces, Utopias and Heterotopias from 1967. He says something like, the garden is a rug onto which the whole world comes to enact its symbolic perfection, and the rug is a sort of a garden that can move across space. Now, we'll probably come back to the garden project,
we'll circle back, yes.
As you said, I'll just show you a very short clip from, talking about ideas of control, space. In 2006, I worked, so a lot of my video installations are actually spatial, so that they are to be navigated and to be experienced sort of bodily rather than sitting and watching like cinema. So it's an idea I'm very interested about. Seeing in kind of multivalently, seeing from different perspectives simultaneously, which is the way we perceive the world, because we see but we also think, and which is almost the opposite of what the cinema does. Tarkovsky, for example, he said something like, this idea of the multiplex cinema for him was a formula for chaos, because in his understanding, cinema should be observed on a single screen. And whereas I'm thinking, that we have different ways of engaging with reality. Now, point of the
often why your installations are multi-dimensional.
They're multi-dimensional, multi-sensory, and I also use multiple sort of directional sound speakers within them. So you navigate the space through the use of sound as well as through imagery. And sometimes, they all kind of synchronize. Specifically, this one was one of the early examples. It's a 6-channel video called Point of Departure, which looks at kind of not just ideas of space. I'm talking about sort of globalized space relationship between specific spaces, but also looking at airport as a transitional space, as place in between spaces and between. Maybe I can play a little bit. So what you will see is, so the installation itself, as I said, it's fairly large. There's one channel that's projected on the floor, which shows X-rayed images of goods going through the X-ray machines, kind of subliminally enacting that idea of smuggling and so on. And then there's a sense of narrative. This is one of the early works where I started working with scripted materials, but I had to script for 6 channels, which was quite interesting to as a method. There is no method in per se, so I had to actually develop a way of filming this and working with a theme. Mike Figgis, for example, when he shot Time Code, and he's a musician by training, and Figgis talked about using a musical scores to write a script for 4 channels, for 4 screens. And it's a very interesting film because the way it was shot is different from what I did here. But he basically had 4 teams shooting simultaneously at the same time and sometimes overlapping, arriving at the same place at the same space and converging into a single story and then breaking out again.
But they were shown on multi-screens or singular?
On a single split screen, so it's a cinematic format.
Cinematic format, I see.
So it had to be for cinema. So in a way, what you will see here is a split. I will only show you maybe just a little bit, just to get a sense.
Please.
Because what I've prepared here is a split screen channel version, and hopefully we'll be able to. It's an ambient sound. It is a hustle and bustle of airports. It was filmed at what I call the endpoints of the European idea, an airport in England, in the UK, and an airport in Turkey on the Black Sea called Trabzon. This is very much maybe on the Silk Road, actually, I'm thinking of that. It definitely features in the mythological story of Jason and the Argonauts. They stopped by there on their way to Georgia to retrieve the Golden Fleece. So, and I kind of color-coded Trabzon is a warmer colors and Stansted is bluish green colors. And we filmed with multiple cameras, but sometimes they show the same scene. I mean, the way they synchronize is quite complex. And there is one channel that dominantly shows the scene from a bird's eye view. And kind of starts, it's almost like I mentioned Vertov, because Vertov's kino eye film starts in the dawn, it's very early in the morning, an empty city, and then gradually builds up all the way, goes through the cycle, and then arriving in the evening. And this film is very similar. It starts with an empty airport, and then going through the day, and finishes with an empty airport. Yes, we have an issue.
So the element of surveillance is very interesting because this was the first
This is
where
a
you started
security
to imagine
announcement.
the idea
To
about
reduce the
trade,
number of security
about
alerts,
history,
passengers
but
must
also
take their
thinking
baggage
through
with them at all
this
times.
connection of what you just described as the end points where Europe meets, which is what Venice is right now for us. We're thinking of it as a gateway, but also the points for the Mediterranean and for continental Europe.
Absolutely, yeah. Venice is the place where, going back to the carpet project, where the first carpets actually arrived through Venice, and this was the place where it entered the kind of the European market, if you like.
You're
And in a way,
reconfiguring the Silk Road.
exactly, sort of the X-ray footage is almost like a carpet that's subliminal. It's under you, and actually we're kind of repeating that. Working on a similar idea. In the project with Sofia and Emmy. It is about two characters, one from the west, one from the east, traveling in opposite directions, meeting a journalist and a researcher, and then exchanging ideas about place and placelessness, belonging, and so on and so forth, and then kind of going in their separate ways. But yes, you can see that probably on my website. So I'll probably stop here, and very quickly in another project that deals with the notions of borders is a piece called Liminal Crossing. It was commissioned in 2009 for exhibition I did at Ludwig Forum in Aachen, and it was exactly 20 years almost to the day when these events took place. This was a migration and exodus from Bulgaria, ethnic Turks from Bulgaria migrating to Turkey. I mean, they were it was a pushed migration, of course, it was forced migration. And some of this was voluntary. It was very political. I guess the government at the time was trying to release pressure, so the only way of not repeating what happened maybe in former Yugoslavia was to kind of what happened in this particular episode. So we're talking about nearly 750,000 people migrating within 3 months, crossing borders, and this is a story which was told to me. It's a personal story. I didn't witness it, but I lived with it for 20 years, and I didn't know what to do with it because I thought it's very poetic. The idea of migrating and taking a piano across a border.
We showed this work in Sharjah in
Yes,
Microsophia
yeah.
in 2012. Yes, yeah.
Absolutely. I'll just show very little, just to give you a sense of the piece. So it was shot from 2 points of view. Again, this is just a split-screen version. One entering from Bulgaria into Turkey, and the other one facing the action from Turkey, looking into Bulgaria. It's an interesting border because the border on the Turkish side is one of the largest. I think it's the second largest after San Antonio. I'm not sure. I think it's.
I think there are some parallels there, but I can't remember the exact.
Exactly. But on the Bulgarian side, it's 2 lanes. It is about control. It is about really sort of getting way of finding ways of maintaining that sort of. And between the 2 countries, there is a massive buffer zone. It's about a kilometer long. A zone. It's a no man's land. It doesn't belong neither to. I mean, in a lot of my work, I'm repeating this. I'm working with territories that are in between places, like in Downward Straits, where I filmed ships crossing the Bosphorus Strait at night. And very similarly, the Bosphorus Strait it doesn't belong. It's neither Europe or Asia. It's in between. It's it is the border of the 2, and sort of the parallel, and the ships are kind of going in almost incognito, invisible, sort of at night, crossing a parallel of that border.
Sort of the piano here is like a sliding signifier between borders, between spaces, much like the carpet becomes. as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, no, well, yeah, that's a good point. And I'll maybe just skip. So it similarly starts at sort of afternoon and going into the night, and when sort of the group crosses the border. It was very complicated, of course, to film on an active border. It took me a year to get permissions from both sides, because this is. I mean, currently it's a border between not just East and West, but the European Union and non-EU. Before 1990, it was the reversal, because Turkey was almost to the west and Bulgaria was to the east. And now it's the other way around. It's an interesting sort of dichotomy there.
Interesting, because Bulgaria entered the EU, but Turkey didn't.
Yeah.
Was it not allowed?
Well, they've been candidates since, I don't know, sort of late 50s, early days of European. So, yeah, that's.
So perhaps now we can sort of reconfigure some of these ideas within the current project that you have been developing for the Panoptic Garden.
Yes, absolutely. So the Panoptic Garden, I'll just read a couple of very short passages. So, I mean, I mentioned that my practice has been informed by significantly by theories and themes surrounding notions of liminality, border crossing, and so on. So the project is called Ephemeral Grounds, and it evolved from an idea I developed a while ago, actually, for a single-channel video and sound installation. The initial concept was to examine the border between the visible and the invisible, the ephemeral and the eternal, and how technologies interpret and shape ways of seeing. So, as I said, it was conceived with the idea to feature a weaving of a traditional carpet, oriental carpet or kilim, that's filmed with a time-lapse camera for the duration of approximately 3 months. Sometimes it's longer, depends how long it takes to weave a handmade carpet. I mean, 3 months is the minimum, actually, for handmade ones. And the film was to record the action from bird's eye view, very much like you've seen the X-ray image here. And the idea was to project it into the space, so whilst you're walking in the space, the carpet will start building under your feet and kind of introduce you. Of course, they're all this. I mean, I mentioned Foucault and all these symbolic kind of connotations to gardens and paradise and space and place and
control.
And control, of course, yeah. Control, very much control, because that also links to ideas of gardens, and we talked earlier about the idea of the first panopticon that was, in fact, actually, Bentham took the idea from Louis XIV, who built a zoo in his garden at the Versailles Palace. With a panopticon in the middle of it, with the idea to observe the animals from different perspectives. So it was kind of sectioned, working, radiating from the center, and this was the model for the first panopticon that Bentham developed, and then of course it was contextualized exactly, and then became the prison and so on. So it's interesting how the garden, the panopticon, and the carpet relate to one another in a peculiar sort of fashion.
Sure, yeah. So I think building on this conversation, it was very fascinating to work with Ergin. Sophia and I are both students. I graduated from ITP. We've both been working with game engine tools, Unity and Unreal. So it was interesting to translate this carpet textile into terrain and building off the metaphors and spatially as well. And taking Venice as our setting, our site-specific setting, as the world's emporium, looking at Islamic-Venetian exchange, artistic exchange, trade, migration, also transforming this textile into a liminal space that can be navigated three-dimensionally in a first-person view. So it was a very fascinating collaboration, and I'm excited to present to you a little bit of a preview here in Unity. And we'll just bring it up shortly. But also within the context of Islamic-Venetian relations, and the inspiration was an Anatolian carpet from Konya. And we actually took an image of the carpet, rendered it into a three-dimensional space using, and Sophia can elaborate more on that as well. Yeah. Oh, here we go. And the notion of ephemeral grounds here being water. As well.
Right, so this interface right now is Unity Game Engine. Just to give you a little background on how a lot of video games that we're looking at, or anything that's sort of on the web as well. And so the end goal for this one will be a web-based experience. And what I did is essentially translated this carpet into a metallic structure, which is, technically speaking, we are using different materials and we're creating different materials, but we're still using the same texture and the same detail that is on the carpet itself. So I converted this image into a 3D model, and that is what we're looking at right now. And the initial project was to actually have each one of these panels cut out and animated so that it slowly grows into something that actually can no longer be navigated. And so this is what we have so far in the experience. And eventually we'll be able to navigate this experience as a first-person player. So I don't know if we're familiar with sort of navigation tools for experiences or video games, but it will be a first-person view. And I can give you a preview of that as well.
Being a web-based work, you can navigate it with your keyboard as well. This will be launched on the Uzbekistan National Pavilion site in the forthcoming week.
So instead of the camera overview, we are now inside of the world.
So we actually had a field trip today to the Fortuny Museum and Marco Polo's house, so this was amazing context for our work. And interesting, like the carpets would be displayed sometimes on the walls because they were so precious alongside all the silks and velvets. And together with Ergin, yes, and on the street as well. And together with Ergin, we decided to work with the model of Venice and situate it here.
Eventually it will go over the water, right, Ami?
Yes, eventually it will go over the water, so the water is rising, the idea of ephemeral grounds. And as one basically carefully has to tread through this space, and once you're within the space, within the carpet, it seems like a three-dimensional structure. So I guess the warp and weft become walls in a sense, and yeah.
So it was interesting that you took this idea of the wet ontology and sort of the dry in terms of the carpet, but then it fuses at one point.
Yes, yeah. So they do fuse, and essentially we were playing around with the idea of placing the carpet on a bridge originally or within a courtyard. We could actually move this so like the water will slowly rise as one's moving through it, and that being a liminal space as well. There's no, I guess, real start or end. Yeah. And Sophia, if you want to talk a bit about your process. Sophia is an animator and illustrator and 3D modeler, so this is all her amazing work.
Sure, the process was a little difficult, actually, especially trying to hold the integrity of the original carpet itself. And what I had to work with was an image, and I can show you.
Maybe we can pull up the reference.
Sure.
Image if you have it, actually.
All right.
And I think, Ergin, you took inspiration from a carpet that you found in a book, and you mentioned this book. I forgot the name of it, but yeah.
The book is by an American Austrian architect called Christopher Alexander, and he's an avid collector of carpets. He probably has some of the largest collection of carpets from specific interest in Anatolian carpet, Central Anatolia, Konya, Uşak, and I think this is a Konya version, as you mentioned. What's interesting about carpets is that we don't have very old carpets that have been preserved. So they all, I think the oldest dates like 12th century or something. So which is peculiar. You know, you would think that they're older ones that survived, but there aren't that many. And this is a very, very typical. I mean, they're all kind of symbolic representations, ideas about perfection, imperfection. In fact, Sarah and I were talking. I made a whole piece, wrote, in fact, a feature film, which is based on the idea of imperfection and perfection in carpets. That was commissioned by UK Film Council back in the day, and it takes place in a place called Hereke, which is near Istanbul, which was designated by the Sultan to produce the finest silk carpets, and they still do. Handmade, it takes a long time, and each carpet has to have an imperfection built into the structure. Yes, and I was looking for something that's quite geometric, because, as I said, the original idea for this was a sculptural piece, very much like what Sophia's recreated, made from highly polished sort of steel, and with the edges, the patterns bending upwards, so becoming a treacherous ground, so the one you can't step, you can't go over, and an obstacle as such. So,
Right.
yeah.
And also the transcultural dimensions. It wasn't given our trip today as well. It was also the Venetian had trading partners with the Mughal dynasty in India, the Safavids in Iran, the Ottomans in Turkey. So the carpet is quite symbolic of this transcultural visuality, I guess. And thinking through our discourse on the Silk Road and Venice being a terminal for that, this was some of our reasoning behind this work.
Very good point, because I mean, I were talking about sound, music earlier, and the patterns in carpets have they're well traveled, very much like sound, moving across sort of the Orient and Occident in terms of kind of enrichment and change. Of course, that's quite interesting. Sort of these. We talked about Roma music earlier, and I have a project. You want to? Shall we show it? Okay, maybe I can, if I can borrow that. Yes, when you finish.
Sure. I think my last comment for, I guess, the process is that a lot of our work has to do with symmetry, and that's something that I learned along the way, especially with these carpets, is that there are imperfections, and each piece was extremely different. So in cutting out each piece, it was a very intimate process, and there was no sort of copy and paste and mirroring effect. It was all very much individualized. So that was a very unique process for me in working with this carpet, and it made it much more beautiful as well. And I had to pay a lot more attention to each one of the shapes, because even though I think from afar they seem very similar, and when you get up close, each one of these petals and each one of these, it's extremely unique. So learning new things every day, every project.
Thank you. Thanks, Sophia. I really appreciate it. I mean, it's been a joy actually working with you too. And okay, what I wanted to show you is back in. Well, it's an old idea. I mean, I've been living with this idea for a long time, because anecdotally, during my military service in Bulgaria in late sort of 80s, I spent quite a bit of time with Roma, in Roma culture, and that was very much my kind of important encounter with Roma music, and I always had the fascination with Lorca's writings around Siguriaya and flamenco and so on and so forth. So I always felt that, but when it came to this particular project, my interest was beyond that. My interest was purely conceptual. It was with the idea of defying space and borders. And so the piece is called Quintet Without Borders, and the idea is that the Roma music travels across space and time and defies kind of cultural and physical borders as such. And in order to achieve that, I started with the premise of working with a group of musicians who would be asked to perform their own part within a composition individually at their dream location, because the idea of kind of continuously going somewhere is very much embedded in the culture. And I offered them, I said initially, I will take you anywhere, whether it's in Australia or New York or Rajasthan or you name it, and then we will record your part within that composition there. But of course, logistically, this is not a film production, it's much more complicated, and we had to narrow not just the scope of the project, but narrow the geography, if you like. And as part of this conversation and I did a lot of research around sort of music and worked with a number of musicologists, looking at different geographies from Spain to Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, Greece, in fact. And eventually I came across this particular group of musicians called, that gathered around a lead musician called Selim Sesler, who sadly passed away, but he was a very, very talented clarinet player, and with a unique sound, bordering this idea of Lorca's Duende, and a kind of dark sound that actually, when discovered, I was absolutely stunned by it. I saw them playing in the Denji bar in Istanbul by recommendation, and after trying to explain to them what I'm trying to do, that I would like to film them in separate locations, they said this is impossible because the music is not written. They need to communicate. They need to be in the same space in order to get feedback from one another. However, as I said, working with musicologists, we try to kind of disentangle the way the music is made and performed, and realizing that the rhythm is the one that leads the other instruments, and so on and so forth. So, technically it was complex, but we achieved it, and we, as I said, narrowed the geography. They chose locations, individual locations that are near the town where they all come from. I don't know, radius of 300 sort of kilometers and stuff. But peculiar ones, he's in his mother's bedroom. The bedroom is tiny, you can barely walk into there. He's in front of an abandoned house on the coast, a very kind of melancholic looking location. The clarinet player wanted to see himself more sort of in a grand scheme, in a factory, in a brick factory from the Ottoman era, and so on and so forth. So I'll play a bit, and as I said, the music is gradually becomes synchronized. So it starts out of sync, and then they do converge into a. So let's see if we can get the sound. It's a long piece. It's about 21 minutes, so we'll play just the beginning of it. I mean, it was absolutely a blast actually working with them. I collaborated with an old friend of mine on this project and invited him to take part in the whole production. The clarinet player, sadly he passed away, but they had their own momentum. They were discovered around the same time as I worked with them by the Guardian journalist who wrote about Selim Sesler as he framed him as the Coltrane of the clarinet, and he called him a genius. And in a way, not far from that description, really, because he was unique in terms of voice and the way he interpreted the sound of the clarinet. And I've seen them at the Barbican in London on a couple of occasions. The public was standing for the entire duration. I mean, and they've been at Carnegie Hall. They've traveled a lot, since they were discovered. So quite unique. I'm sure there are many voices like this out there that needs to be discovered. So.
Hello, sorry. Thank you so much, Ergin. This was wonderful. What I want to point out was that these musicians have never played singular before. They always play in sync. So maybe you can say something about that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the whole idea, as I mentioned, is that they will not just reference each other, but they will get a feedback from one another in order. So there will be a loose structure they'll conform to, and then the percussion, the tarambuka, what we call, will lead the rhythmic section, and they will adjust to that. However, I mean, they do digress and they do go into different sort of ways. But for them, this was quite a challenge because they never played the same song. I mean, they had to imagine it actually. So I mean, this.
Amazing. So a lot of your work relies on that idea of the absent as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, think about the anamorphic drawings where the space is absent, but it's projected. It's a mental space. It's sort of the Duchampian 4-dimension, and I mean, obviously we didn't talk about that, but I'm not going to show. I will just give you a sense of. Sarah and I have actually.
It's in artworks. There.
So, I don't have my glasses.
Anamorphic drawings.
Yeah, so these are. They kind of border the idea of informal architecture. They're projections. They are anamorphic projections that become three-dimensional from a particular point of view. Again, folding into this idea of the surveillance and somebody being surveyed, and because in order to see them three-dimensionally, the drawings are seen through a camera, and when somebody's within that space, they become.
If you click on the pavilion one, and then you can show.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have, this is the kind of the projection, and this is what the camera sees, or the brain can see. I mean, we can see that as well, but the eye sees it, the brain struggles. That's interesting, So you start seeing things lifting off and then collapsing again. So the first piece I ever done was around the panopticon idea, and again it was at Ludwig Forum. It was a drawing that was conceived to be seen with the naked eye, and so there was a particular distance from the projection where you start seeing it. But as I said, I realized that it is the brain that really can't connect sometimes, so it keeps on coming and going. It's quite interesting actually. And then when seen through camera, it automatically becomes three-dimensional. So I kind of built on that idea. And
so the idea of illusion, and there's a sort of sleight of hand in terms of magic, although it's not magic, it's just to do with perception.
It's perception.
Yes.
Yeah, it's perception. It is. Yeah, I mean, this is another.
Click on the Guggenheim one, please.
Yeah, this is the one we worked on. This was probably one of the most. It's a fragment, but it was very complex because, in order to build this, I work with architects or teams of technicians that reimagine that space three-dimensionally in order to position the object or the subject within that space, and then that gets translated into, gets collapsing into its own shadow, and that becomes
This is the
anamorphic drawing.
sphere of the whole drawing. But similarly, in what Ami and Sophia have taken this idea really, and it becomes more of a three-dimensional form. But translating this is within the physical form. Now we're entering the virtual space. So you're taking the anamorphic drawings into and combining that with the Anatolian carpet to take it into a virtual space. So this is where the world-building
Absolutely.
concept comes in. And I want Sophia and Ami to speak a little bit about that,
absolutely.
please.
It is a direct translation, definitely, and I look at the actionist approach to perception, where it really does matter where you are physically in space. And so when you take that into a digital space and you have infinite freedom to move around, I think that also adds another layer to it. But it is quite literally the peeling off and sort of placing back that you were saying earlier, really based on where you are and your perception.
Right. I would just add that it does become, I would even add more multidimensional in virtual and 3D space, because you're literally looking at it from all different perspectives, up, down, sideways. You can, it's 360. And yeah, we did actually start by, we did start exploring this idea with these anamorphic drawings originally. So it's nice to see that thread continue.
I think we can ask for some questions.
Sure. Does anybody have any questions or would like to comment or anything? Yeah.
Yeah, I was more interested. Hello, and thank you for having joined us. I was really interested in this also patterns that you showed us before. And are you working just with specific types of carpets, or you are interested also in kind of discovering what are the similarities between different patterns? Because I think Uzbekistan is the language in Uzbekistan is also a Turkish. It belongs to this Turkish group, So if we similarly see also the patterns, is there also some kind of similarities, and have you researched that, let's say, in the region? Because linguistically that's a same region, and so I was wondering if the patterns are also kind of repeating, and to a certain extent they are, and if you are interested and have researched that. And
Are they? Oh, I see. Okay, that's interesting. I have done some research back in the day when I was working on the film. I mentioned the film about carpets, and I know that there is an axis where it kind of follows a similar pattern, but there are actually two axes, because the understanding about patterns in like Khorasan, Sarah mentioned, or Iranian or Persian carpets is different from the one that evolved in Anatolia. And Anatolian actually is quite unique. I mean, I mentioned Christopher Alexander, who is an architect, and he kind of claims that he's based his practice, his understanding about architecture on the patterns, because the patterns themselves are quite distilled. In the sort of specifically Uşak and Konya, they're very simplified. They're geometric, but they're probably most removed or remote from floral or animal patterns. I mean, you will discover some animal patterns actually in Persian carpets, but you wouldn't find them in any of. Yes, there is definitely a correlation. When you look at, the book we were looking at, they said there is an axis. I have to follow it, and because the axis is interesting, it is through religious interpretations, the way they approach the making of the carpet, but it's also the cultural ones, the overlaps, as you mentioned, sort of the Turkic language, like carpets in Kyrgyzstan and some in Uzbekistan, would probably have very similar patterns that are slightly different from others. And
the carpet that we saw yesterday in the Armenian island in the monastery are from the Caucasus, so they have a more correlation with the carpet that Ergin showed today. The Persian carpet, the motif is more floral. Here there's more of an abstract design. But there's something very interesting, because scholars have actually analyzed 16th century Anatolian carpets and looked at the formation of the pattern language, and actually it's so close to the rhythms and patterns of computer science that nobody can really decipher how that is actually possible. There is a fantastic text called Pattern Language, written by an Austrian.
It's the same. It is Christopher Alexander. Yeah.
Yes, Christopher Alexander. Excuse me. Yes, it's the same author called Pattern Language that looks at the sort of relationship between algorithmic thinking in terms of this ancient weaving process. And something Ergin didn't mention is that with all Islamic craft, including carpets, there's always a mistake, but only the artisan is aware of it. Nobody would ever be able to understand that mistake because we wouldn't be able to see it. But it's always a small knot.
Mistake, yes.
Yes, because it celebrates that only God is perfect and nothing else can ever imitate that. So there's always this idea of imperfection, but it becomes, as we see it with our naked eye, perfect.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting with the Ottoman era, because the Ottoman era carpets in the sort of 17th, 18th, 19th century were different. You know, they started bridging the two worlds, if you like. They became closer to the, from what I've seen, becoming closer to the kind of the Persian carpets in terms of intricacy and motifs. And that was partially because almost 100% of the carpet makers were Armenian. And they brought their own sort of understanding of, I mean, specifically the very fine silk carpets in Hereke. They were entirely built by, sort of made, woven by Armenians. The practice still continues. There are small workshops, and I've seen them. They're under not just protection, but they are under surveillance as well, because the orders come from who knows from where. It takes about 5 years to make a single silk carpet. They're very fine. Very difficult. One interesting thing about patterning is that there are a lot of theories about the way the Persian carpets animate. So the idea that the pattern starts animating, and the way I think it was almost on purpose. You know, the way they were woven. So when the eye starts, you know, following a pattern, they become animated, they become almost rhythm, very much like what we were trying to achieve with this one. And there's intention, but it's something to look at, I think. You know.
In Iranian cinema, there is a film by Mohsen Makhmalbaf called Gabe. I think part of his Makhmalbaf film house, and in there it's a child's carpet is Gabe in Persian, which is one that's in the children's cot or in the child's playroom, and it becomes animated. All the stories come alive.
Right.
And so the characters relive that fairy tale, but it's a similar idea of this pop-up 3D that sort of interjects. So you can imagine it's not exactly a pop-up, but it is a sort of form that we look at the carpet as a flat 1D surface. It becomes three-dimensional.
No, I mean it's all about perspectives, really. It's all about. So I'm talking about anamorphism here, but it is about seeing dimensional and think about perspective. And it's the same with carpets, but it's not just the carpets that then spills into miniature. The miniature art is very much about rendering things into the distance. And Heidegger wrote about sort of the idea of the nearness, that he started from the point of miniature and also, you know, perspective and air and the way things are. Because in miniatures you will have scenes that are of importance, you know, within the kind of narrative of the story that are at a distance, but they appear close to us because they are more important than something that is at the fore of the foreground. So, you know, they're not rendered in perspective; they're rendered by importance, by deliberacy somehow.
I just wanted to also comment that often in Persian miniatures, you can see carpets, especially in depictions of courtly garden feasts. You'll see carpets as a ornamentation as like a wall, so it's often just as a tent or a backdrop to add perspective, but it becomes almost like a ceiling as well. And
Oh, fascinating. Thank you.
Anton?
Ergin, thank you for the presentation, very interesting. I was looking at your previous projects, and I can really see the classical education in a way how I think a lot of your practice is based on observation, and I think that's where kind of the classical education comes in. And I think the kind of unskilling it comes with the flattening of the space. So, and I see it both in your kind of anamorphic drawing, and also with your positioning of the camera, right? So you're really decisive where you put the camera, how you stop the motion, and how you position it in the viewing. So in a way, the flattened space is very present, and I think that becomes kind of the kind of your author's point of view, right? That's how you kind of tell your story and how you kind of frame the project. So as you're working with virtual reality, where you have the infinite space, which you cannot really flatten in a way. So what becomes kind of the author's hand? Is it the, what challenges do you meet when you're working with an infinite space as a medium?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It's a very different challenge, absolutely. I mean, I was talking to Sophia and Amy about, I spent the year of the second year, or pretty much the 2 years of lockdown, working on a series of animation, 3D animation projects. And I found myself doing exactly what you described, looking at the world three-dimensionally, you know, working with an animate and trying to see the correct angle, and then deciding on a camera position, you know, at a singular point, you know, how do I collapse that into one singular image? And of course, then you have notions of, you know, how does it become, because all of the 5 animators I've been working on are cyclical, so there's no end and beginning and end. And yes, when we started actually thinking about that, you know, we were discussing, is it going to be an animation? Are we going to be augmented reality or a virtual reality project? And of course, as you said, the VR is democratic. It depends on the viewer to how and when and in what capacity to see the image. And so, in fact, we kind of build that in the description, if you like. You know, how do we engage with the object? That no matter from where you approach the object, you always have to go over that surface. So there is a almost kind of condition, if you like, within the game environment. But that's the only one.
So there's a script for a player in a way, right?
Almost, yeah, like that, yeah.
So if I can kind of proceed with this idea, because for the film, of course, the montage, especially if you're kind of referencing Vertov, the montage, the editing is the key, right? That's what kind of takes what you take responsibility for as an artist. Yeah. So how do you deal with it with a kind of such a, with a medium like VR? Because is there a montage, and how is it can be applied to it? Sorry?
Yeah. I mean, maybe you can answer that question, actually.
Sure. So far, this is going to be a web-based project, but montage in VR is something that I've explored a lot, because we don't have cuts and we don't have a frame, but we do still have a space that can be brought in and out of a consciousness. So it makes them, you are inside of that montage. Again, you are no longer a viewer, you're a visitor. So the montage happens when the space around you closes and opens back up. But I think for this space as well, it really is we have the X and the Y axis. We all experience that every day, and then there's the Z axis, and that's kind of the wild card in creating in 3D spaces for the web, desktop, virtual reality, especially virtual reality, because then we can navigate that as, again, embodiment. But it all goes back to perspective, I think, for this project as well. And
so it's the bridging of the spaces that becomes kind of the transition, becomes the cut.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And I also love using not just visuals, but sound as well. So when we make this a multi-sensory experience, we allow more for transitions or for montage or illusion. It really is all illusion when you're in virtual reality. Yeah.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Anton. It's, I mean, yeah, conceptually, it's a good question to address, I think.
And to that, I would also add sight lines. So I think one thing I think about, Sophia mentioned montage and a frame. I think it is incredibly VR is a very unwieldy medium, and often I find myself at least putting on my headset, getting back into the space to test it out. I think what I found works for me is testing out the sight line in first person, because in a way you can edit based on that. If you're working with the landscape, for example, you decide where you want to place a mountain. It's kind of like the limit, I would argue, in a way, and you can guide the viewer based off of sight lines or kind of nudge. It's just a different way of thinking about montage or editing or juxtaposition and it's almost like choreography as well. So I feel like with VR, you're just adding more factors, but you kind of have to think about them, one by one in a list and see how it's like composing, yeah.
Are there any, thank you, Antoine. Are there any questions? Any further questions? Andreas, did you want to say a last word?
And I know that you are also referring in your work, maybe we can go and then reconnect also. We saw several museums and we saw how there was a connection between Venice and it was one of the stations on the Silk Road. So are you interested, like, by developing this project somehow to address also, let's say, that kind of avenue which led from here till China and then backwards, like so is it going to be like a project that will evolve and through which you want to also kind of address that heritage of the Silk Road and then Marco Polo?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been addressing this in a different way. I've been looking at, we mentioned Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities, which looks at, within Invisible Cities, there's so many, I read earlier before you came a passage from the book, which is about the idea of the gardens and, eudexia and connecting it to carpets and so on and so forth. So I've been looking at kind of deconstructing concepts within the book, treading through the kind of the Silk Road, if you like, whether it's through kind of working on ideas of borders or I have another piece called Voyage of No Return, which is a Calvino concept where he describes a port which only knows departures but not returns. But I found it quite interesting because obviously the Silk Road is all about treading back and forth, whereas he's pointing about a place which only knows departures, which is inevitably it is about sort of migration and so on. But if you look at it as a point of enrichment and thinking of it as a kind of multidimensional idea, I'm sure there will be sort of other projects that will converge some of these notions into kind of visual language or art projects. At the moment, I mentioned the 3D animation pieces, which are based, it's a different body of works, but they are based on Neolithic objects that I found in museums, which are again along the same axis. They tread to the same, but going way back in time and looking at kind of before the idea of the Silk Road. Yes, the idea is yes, but it will. Sarah and I did a project in Baku, for example, years ago, very much looking at some of the prevalent issues in the region, in Baku, similar kind of anamorphic, looking very abstract, but commenting on space and place and sort of geopolitics and so on. So, thank you.
Are there other questions or comments? Sorry. Right. So at that point, I think we can conclude also this session. Thank you so much.